Electric motors, turbochargers, superchargers, and KERS are all things this Volvo XC90 has. That's because this XC90 is the T8 Recharge, and with a claimed WLTP of 80 to 112 mpg, it should make me feel good about saving the polar bears. Or will it? My name's Tom, and you're watching Paragon Cars. Let's go. Before we get going, only 1.4% of our viewers are subscribed, so please do subscribe if you're not already. And why not hit the bell as well, as it allows us to keep bringing you this awesome content. Now, at the front of this Lanyard lies a 299 bhp supercharged and turbocharged 2-litre engine, and it powers the front wheels. Yeah, that's right, the front wheels only. Thankfully, electricity powers the rear, and tops up that 299 bhp power figure by another 86, giving you a total of 385 horsepower and a whopping 640 Nm of torque. That means this tree hugger should get to 60 in just 5.5 seconds. But what about something more realistic? Let's see how it does on the 30 to 70 sprint. Now, before you attack me in the comments, yes, I know it says the run is invalid. However, I did do 8 other runs and got nearly exactly the same result every single time. Talking about the result though, it's pretty impressive. We managed 5.43 seconds, so we're almost neck and neck with a Mark III Ford Focus RS. Not bad for a car that weighs the same as a small planet. Sprint over, let's have a look at the interior. This XC90 is an Inscription Plus trim, which basically means it's the fancy one in the range. There's a lot of extras to talk about, but the main upgrades you get include the Orifice glass gear selector, fine Napa leather trim, and some open pore wood. As cabins go, this is certainly up there in terms of quality, but design wise it's still not quite as fancy as a Mercedes GLE or Audi Q7. But if the Swedes know how to do one thing better than the Germans, it's comfort. The seats envelop you with warmth or cold, and the heated steering wheel is just on another level. So many luxury cars boast this feature, but most of them give you a lukewarm experience at best, whereas this one literally microwaves your hands to perfection. It even has 3 different settings: cremate, perfect, and medium rare. And all of those things are controlled through this touchscreen. And whilst it certainly takes some time getting used to the menus, it's still a great system overall. Good response and a resolution that I expect for 2021. The rear is just as impressive. Again, we have heated seats, but also copious amounts of room. You'll never get sick back here either, as the panoramic roof lets plenty of light in. But maybe you want a kip. Well, close the roof, raise the shades, recline the seat, and you'll be dreaming of fluffy polar bears in no time. Now we come to a section of the car where most big SUVs completely fall apart: the third row. But you see, unlike other manufacturers, Volvo has realised that people with legs might actually want to use the third row. Both the driver and middle row seat are set in a comfortable position for me, and look, I actually have legroom. There's even cup holders, your own vent, and some nifty storage. Of course, being an SUV, the boot is vast, but there's also some really clever design features that make this a diverse as well as large space. There's 2 layers of underfloor storage, one for your cable and the other for your toolkits. There's then this flip-up tray that stops smaller items from flying around, and there's even a sensor that allows you to open the boot by waving your foot under the bumper. Also, it actually works, and over the many shopping trips I've done with this car, I've actually used this feature pretty much every time. Okay, tour done, let's see if this Volvo can cut the mustard. So, driving the Volvo XC90 T8. So we've got a 42-mile journey ahead of us, and our battery says we've got 20 miles of range. so it should theoretically do nearly half the journey on battery power alone. We're starting off around town, so I've put the car in pure electric mode, and then I've put the gear selector in something called B, which basically regens energy when you come off the throttle. So you can almost drive this car with just the accelerator pedal. And yes, I know I don't have a full battery charge. It would get better MPG if I did have one. But this is kind of a real world test. You're not always going to have a full battery. But initial impressions then. Going over the bumps back there, we don't have the air suspension option in this, but we do have really good dampers. And they just deal with bumps so well. You could go over those speed bumps at 25, 30 miles an hour and you wouldn't even feel it. The steering is nice and light, and the weights for the accelerator and the brake are pretty good. You do kind of have to get used to the regen braking system though. It can feel a little bit jerky at times. In terms of parking, this car has a whole suite of cameras because this is the inscription model. Obviously you've got a reverse camera with some lines telling you where you're going to go, and then you've also got a 360 view as well, which is just overhead. And it makes parking very, very easy. There's also all-round parking sensors, even on the side of the car. So getting into a parking space, even though this is a massive car, is really easy. One thing you might have noticed then is just how many times I had to blip the gear selector switch. For some reason, Volvo decided that you have to blip it twice to put it into drive. I don't really understand why they've done that. And it does take some getting used to. The first time I got into this car, I sort of put it in neutral, put my foot down, and the car went nowhere. Not exactly ideal. Now you might think 86 horsepower isn't that much for a big car like this, but put your foot down in electric mode and you'll get out of junctions with pretty reasonable pace. And see, it gets up to 30 miles an hour just fine. So far, the trip computer says we're averaging 65 mpg, so we might be saving the polar bears after all. Before we get on the motorway, let's see how this Volvo handles some corners. It does have nearly 400 horsepower after all, so it should be pretty tasty. I'm going to go for power mode. This will use the engine and the electric motor combined. It does feel like it stiffens up the suspension, although I'm not sure if it does or not. But coming around corners, put your foot down, and yeah, it gets a fair old lick on. Not hair-raisingly fast though, because this car does weigh 2.7 tons. Also, if you are doing sporty driving, you have adjustable side bolsters. And it just means you're not falling out, you see, when you're going around some twisty corners. So, motorway driving then, what's this Volvo like? Well, it's got something called Pilot Assist, and I've got it on now. And what it'll do is keep me centered in the lane, so it'll do all the steering for me. And it'll also keep me a safe distance behind the car in front of me. And with all these systems, you can adjust how far you want that following distance to be. And thankfully, this Volvo is actually pretty good. It'll follow cars pretty closely. Quite a few other systems, even at the closest setting, they won't get that close to the car in front. And the problem in the UK is obviously if you're sitting in the passing lane, overtaking cars, people actually cut in front of you because they think you're too far behind from someone. But thankfully that doesn't happen in this Volvo. The next thing we're going to go on to is refinement. And of course, if the car is doing the driving for you, it just takes the strain out of long motorway journeys. Another thing that alleviates that strain is the lack of road and wind noise. Of course, when you're making a hybrid car, you don't have that engine noise. So, like any other manufacturer, Volvo have made sure that the sound deadening in this car is top notch. It's not quite as good as something like an Audi Q7, but it's right up there. It's so close. Now, visibility. SUVs can sometimes be quite intimidating, and especially ones that are this large, but thankfully Volvo have placed massive windows on the side of the car, and it just means changing lanes is really easy. Plus you do have a blind spot monitor as well, so it'll tell you if there's anyone in your blind spot. Another thing you want in any expensive car is a pretty good speaker system. Although this is the inscription model, you do only get the standard speaker system, but it's still really good actually. I would compare it to some upgraded systems in some smaller hatchbacks. It's got really good bass, good mids, although it does lack a little bit in the highs. If you are an audiophile like me, I would upgrade to the Bowers & Wilkins speaker system, because that is absolutely mental in this car. But I have to say, for a standard system, it is still amazingly good. Of course, sometimes you know you're going to be on the motorway for a long time and then you're going to be doing some town driving. So thankfully you can just press this button and it'll hold some battery charge and turn the engine on when you're driving on the motorway. So later when you are driving around town, you're using the most efficient power method. Well, look at that. We managed 87.9 mpg. So we managed the claim figure, right? Well, yeah, we did. And it's very impressive. Although we have only done 16 miles of driving. And I want you to notice that nearly all our battery is gone already. And when that does go, it means you're going to be doing about 32 miles to the gallon max. And if you're driving around town, you'll be lucky to get anything above 25 mpg. Okay, you dropped the kids off at school and you got a twisty road on the way home. And you're thinking, well, it's got 385 horsepower, should be pretty fun on a B road, right? It's got a power setting for a reason. Now, this isn't the R-Design Pro, so you don't get flappy paddles, but you can still change gears yourself. So let's see what it's like. Now, initially, it feels pretty quickly. Obviously, you get that instant torque from the electric motor, and you also get that supercharger low down, so there's plenty of power. But it does feel a little bit weird at first. Suspension does a good job of controlling the car, but because it's predominantly front-wheel drive, this car feels very hot-hatchy to drive. Actually, there's quite a nice sound to it as well, to be fair. But this really isn't a sports car. The steering is pretty vague, to be honest. But a lot of that is just because it's really light. The biggest problem with big cars like this is tighter corners. You do really have to slow down. But there's no doubt that this car is fast. Anything below 90 miles an hour, this car really picks up the pace. It does feel a bit weird though, driving this car quickly. It doesn't really want to be driven fast. But it'll do it. And although the steering isn't great, once you're at higher speeds, it does have a good bit of weight to it, and you can feel what the rubber's doing underneath you. Now you might be thinking that this Volvo is just a tech experiment that only appeals to people paying company car tax. And to be honest, for the most part, you'd be right. However, this car is far more efficient than I thought it'd be. We always hear how hybrids are always worse in fuel than the equivalent diesel, but if you charge this car up at one of the many free charging points and do the average commute of just 16 miles a day, you'd almost never use any fuel at all. Heck, you could even do up to 40 miles a day and never go below 80 miles per gallon. Even when the battery runs out, you still get 32 mpg on a long run, which for a 2.7 ton SUV is actually pretty reasonable. It's actually changed my perspective, and you know what? You should seriously consider something like this for a family car. So on that quite surprising note, I think I'll end the video here. As always, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and why not subscribe, as not only can you see more videos like this, you can also see everything we have for sale. My name's Tom, and you've been watching Paragon Cars. I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.